Okay, let's call this meeting to order this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I can see that all commissioners are present. The minutes were emailed or mailed to you. We need an approval.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And it stands approved. We will move right into our official business of the day. First official action is resolution 1253, adopting a debt management policy for KUB.
Commissioners, as you all know, we've had informal and formal policies related to debt management. But in 2008, following the financial crisis at that point, the State Comptroller's Office required all municipalities and municipal agencies to adopt a formal debt management policy. We are bringing that to you today upon the recommendation of the Audit and Finance Committee, which reviewed it in their last meeting. I want to assure you, though, that this is not directed at KUB. All municipal agencies throughout the state of Tennessee are undergoing this kind of formal action. So I recognize Mark Walker, who will summarize that for you before we ask for your approval.
Commissioners, I thought I'd start off and just give you a little bit of background information on the debt management policy before you consider it for official action. Ms. Roach is correct. This is a directive that was issued by the State Comptroller at the outset of this year, which requires all municipalities and public entities in the state to have a formal debt management policy in place by January 1st of 2012. And it really was born out of the financial crisis of 2008 when the comptroller became aware, or it became apparent to the comptroller, that there was many municipalities in the state, mostly the smaller ones, that had entered into relatively complex debt transactions that they really didn't understand. And if they didn't understand, they couldn't appreciate the risk and cost associated with the transactions, and it got them into a little bit of trouble in making their debt service payments. So after that, the comptroller spent a good part of a year or so meeting with various issuers across the state, met with KUB and also other stakeholders, and I felt it was appropriate for all the municipalities and public issuers to have a formal debt management policy, which would address the debt issuance activities of every entity, but at a minimum, there was minimum requirements, and those are that every policy should address the understanding of the transaction, that the governing body should understand the transaction fully, that there would be full disclosure of all risk and cost associated with the transactions, and that there would be awareness of potential conflicts of interest. So every policy has to address that, and they sent out language that had to be reflected in every policy as well. As Ms. Roach also mentioned, we have not had a formal debt policy in the past. It's been adopted by the board. We've had a long history of certain practices with respect to debt management, but today, as required by the state, and always a good idea to have, I suppose, we want to have a formal policy adopted by the board. And that policy will formally establish many of those existing practices and procedures that we've had in place for many years. And we'll go over some of those in just a moment. It also reflects, incorporates all the required language that was issued by the comptroller, again regarding disclosure of information of cost and risk for transactions, and making sure everyone understands what you're getting into. The proposed policy does have, I guess, some new aspects of debt management practice, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on those, but those are really based upon the state's requirements and some other recommendations that the comptroller made. We've incorporated some of those as well. I will point out that we did provide a draft of the policy to our financial advisor, Joe Ayers and Morgan Keegan, and also our bond counsel, Bastarian Sims, and the policy before you today does reflect their input. We also got a copy of the city's debt management policy. They've had one in effect since 2006. We sort of use that as a guideline for coming up with the format and structure of our policy. It's not exactly identical, but with respect to format and structure, there's a lot of similarities to it. And then, as Ms. Roach also mentioned, I do want to reemphasize, we did thoroughly discuss the policy with the board's Audit and Finance Committee, and after discussion, they did vote to recommend the board approve it. Some of the key provisions that are set forth in the policy, as you would expect in any policy of this type, there's provisions related to the governance of the debt. Under what authority does KUB use debt? Under what authority do we issue debt? What governing bodies approve it? The KUB board has certain abilities to approve debt. The city has other abilities to approve debt. That's reflected in the policy. The various types of debt that we can issue, revenue bonds, revenue anticipation notes, bond anticipation notes, those are all provided for in the policy as well as the terms of the issuance of the debt. In particular, how far out can maturities go? You may know that we're restricted by state law. We can't issue any further out than 40 years. That's reflected in the policy, but there's also other guidelines with respect to maturities in the policy as well. Interest on debt, there's a section on that which specifically states that for a longer term debt, KUB will give a preference to fixed rate debt on revenue bonds, but however, variable rate may be issued from time to time depending upon the circumstances. But the policy doesn't provide limits for the use of variable rate debt, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. Method of issuance, the board knows that we typically issue it through competitive sale. The policy recognizes that that will be the preference, but again, from time to time, it may be necessary to do a negotiated sale. So there's provisions related to that. And as you know, the Audit and Finance Committee of the board is required to approve the use of a negotiated sale before the bonds are actually sold. Refinancing outstanding debt, we'll talk about that a little bit later today with respect to some proposed refundings we have, but the policy addresses that. It directs staff to look for refunding opportunities and to bring anything to the board for debt service savings if the net present value of the savings is 3% or greater of the bonds to be refunded. So that's an important point. The ones that are shown, the bullets that are shown in italics on this chart, actually reflect some changes to our existing debt management practices. That's why they're in italics, and I want to go into those in a little bit more detail with you. Commissioners, as you know, we've talked about as we've developed our financial plans, there's certain metrics, debt metrics that we use to guide how much debt we use, the timing of the debt, how far out it will go. And the policy actually provides for 4 primary metrics for each division and sets either a maximum or minimum threshold level for those metrics, which each division must be in compliance with for that division to issue debt in the future. And the 2 metrics that are reflected on this chart you might be most familiar with because we've talked about those with the board over time. Those are the debt as a percentage of capitalization and also maximum debt service coverage. The one on the left is our debt as a percent of capitalization, really known as the debt ratio. It simply reflects how much of the utility system's assets are funded by debt. And you can see that the maximum allowed percentages for electric, gas, and water, it's 60%, and for wastewater, it's 70%. And as a point of comparison, you can see what those respective ratios were at the end of last fiscal year. And you can see, obviously, wastewater is relatively high because we've been using a significant amount of debt to help fund the projects under the consent decree. And these levels are set at relatively, what I would say, relatively high levels. So if we were approaching that or giving thought to exceeding those levels, it probably is worthy of board official action to do so. The one on the right, debt service coverage, another one the board's probably familiar with, it simply measures the issuer's ability to repay its debt. It's net earnings available for debt divided by the maximum principal and interest payment over the life of the bond. So it's intended to be somewhat of a stress test. The minimum level required is 1.2 times your maximum debt payment. And that's the same level that is in our bond covenants. So the policy is basically replicating what's already in our bond covenants on that metric.
Mark, I can't remember if we talked about this, but are these percentages, are they guidelines or are they cutoffs to say our policy says we will not?
They are cutoffs. Okay. They are absolute levels that if, for example, it turned out wastewater after the next debt issue was at 72%, it's got to go below 70% before we could issue another set of bonds for wastewater. Now, that's a good question because For both of these metrics, you may say those levels don't look familiar to you because in our annual financial planning process, we use different levels to guide our decision making right now. These are intended to be policy or absolute levels that restrict the further use of debt if you're not in compliance with. Because, for example, on electric, what we currently use as our guideline is 45% or less. And for maximum debt service coverage for electric, we actually use 3.0. Again, these are absolute levels regarding further use of debt. Yes?
Do you know what other utilities use as their guidelines?
On the debt service coverage, these are very typical for being in bond covenants. What they would use for guidelines is probably something similar that we would use. For example, for electric, a 3.0 maximum debt coverage would be appropriate because we've set those levels basically on trying to maintain a AA credit rating.
Okay.
So for other AA's, it would be somewhat similar. Any questions on those two? We are proposing to use an additional set of metrics. This comes from a recommendation by the Comptroller's Office. The one on the left is the percent of principal that would be repaid in the next 10 years. The objective of this metric is to ensure that we don't backload all our debt. For example, we issue $30 million in electric bonds and we put all the principal out in the last 5 years. That is something the Comptroller's Office is very concerned about. They've seen a lot of that throughout the state. KUB has not really done that. We typically issue levelized debt in all of our bond issues. The exception is with wastewater. And you can see that's reflected in our current percentage as far as how much principal we'd be repaying in the next 10 years. It's right above 20%. We feel these levels are appropriate and they give us some flexibility. Wastewater, as you can see, is very close to that minimum threshold. I do anticipate it will improve over time. You might ask, why is it so low right now? Well, ever since we've been under the consent decree and we've issued probably $300 million in long-term bonds since 2004 for wastewater, the bond market long-term rates have been historically low. So our strategy has been to try to take advantage of that. And in many cases, when we issue, the principal is further out, and in some cases, backloaded to take advantage of that. The thought being, as rates rise over time, then you would fill in the gaps and have more short-term principal at lower rates than what would otherwise be the case. But we're getting to the point with our wastewater debt structure that we need to start filling in some of those gaps here in the next few bond issues. And the metric on the right is a new one that we would use, and it measures the amount of variable rate debt that KUB would have for each division. We don't currently have any, as you can see, and we haven't used any for long-term debt in probably close to a decade. But the policy recognizes that it could be used, but it does set a limit on how much each division could use at 25%. Any questions on this?
The percentages, the minimums they're not obviously been set by the state. That's something that we have
That is
decided
correct.
from our perspective. It makes the most sense to us. And what I think I heard you say, that if we go above any of these, we're going to set a resolution in place that has these percentages in it. If we are approaching or going to go above it, we require another resolution.
We require to modify the policy. That's
this
correct.
particular time. Okay.
Yes, sir. That's right.
And the one other question I had about, you mentioned that 3%, we look to refund debt if there's a 3-point spread of what the market is now to what the debt currently is paying.
If the net present value of the debt service savings is 3% or greater than the principal amount that's being refunded, then we would go forward with a refund or recommend it to the board at that time.
Okay.
And actually, when we talk about
that's the next resolution.
right, that's the next resolution on some refundings. I'll show you the actual calculations on that. Another section of the policy I wanted to briefly go over with you. It has to do with the use of professionals in the debt issuance process. And as you know, we use a financial advisor, we use bond counsel, obviously rely upon the rating agencies to rate our debt as well. So the provision provides for that. But a couple of points I wanted to bring to your attention. The second bullet, historically our practice has been to not allow anyone, our financial advisor, anybody providing advisory services to us to also underwrite or bid on the debt. And because of the apparent conflict of interest there. That practice now becomes policy, and that is a recommendation from the state. And it's also a recommendation from the municipal rulemaking, securities rulemaking board as well. But I wanted to make sure that the board was aware of that. And then the last bullet on this chart reflects disclosure of information. This is a new requirement that any of the professionals that we use for a debt issuance transaction, FA, bond counsel, whatever the case may be, they have to disclose to us if they have any business relationships or agreements with other professionals to the transaction. Doesn't mean they can't have it. They just need to disclose it to us so we can make a decision accordingly. And then the last section I want to talk to you about has to do with transparency. We have probably a page and a half of policy that addresses disclosure of information. And I think KUB historically has done a good job in this regard, disclosing information to the board, disclosing information to our customers, but this is something that the comptroller said has to be in your policy and needs to be reflected. So basically, what's changing from what we currently do? Not a lot, but both on the front end and the back end of a debt issue, we're going to probably be disclosing more information to the board and our customers than we have in the past. More specificity, I would say. And then any report that we provide to the board regarding debt issuance, on the front end, on the back end, whatever the case may be, we will post that to the website shortly thereafter the meeting. And those are the highlights of the debt management policy, and I'd be happy to answer any good questions.
Mark, just to clarify one point you made during your presentation, you said that the board's never had a debt policy to date, and even though we haven't had a formal policy, all of the component parts of this policy that we're adopting have been a part of our regular practice in past years. Correct?
That is correct, except the new ones that I referenced.
Okay, all right, and we're just putting this all under one umbrella now in order to comply with recently enacted state law.
That is exactly right.
Other questions?
I move that we adopt resolution 1253.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any visitor comment? I'll have a roll call vote. Mr. Coley, please.
Commissioner Anderson. Commissioner Fennell. Commissioner Jones.
Aye.
Commissioner Robinson.
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons.
Aye.
Commissioner Thompson.
Aye.
Commissioner Williams.
Aye.
Resolution 1253 has passed.
Okay, next item is resolution